So today is the 24th of November, and we are honored here at the Impact School to greet Dr. NicoleAvena, who is going to lecture on food addiction and links to obesity is her lecture's name. And we're going to have her brilliance here today. She has told me, and she will probably just tell you too, how she wants to conduct. She's willing to take questions as she goes and or afterwards. And we have like at least 60 minutes, maybe 90, depending on how crazy we get with, milking out information from you, Nicole. So I want you, please, everybody mute that is not talking. And I'm going to give NicoleAvena, Assistant Professor of Neuroscience, Ethan School of Medicine at Mount Sinai, Visiting Professor of Health Psychology at Princeton University, the word. Go ahead.
Okay, great. Well, thank you again so much, Esther, for inviting me to come and to speak to all of you today. I've been doing research on food addiction for so many years now, and this has been something that's become so much of a passion for me to really educate people about the research on this topic and talk about ways in which we can use this research to better the lives of others, because I think that a lot of people suffer as a result of addiction to food, and they're not always well served in terms of treatments just because of the lack of knowledge and awareness about this issue in the general public. So what I thought we'd do today is I'm going to walk you through some of the research on this topic that I think you'll be interested in hearing about. If you have questions, please just interrupt, and I'm happy to take questions throughout the presentation, or if you want to save them till the end, that's fine too, but whatever you feel convenient doing. So here's a little bit of an outline of what I plan to discuss today. So I want to pose this through the lens of obesity, and I'll go through why when we get to that point. But I began studying food addiction because I had an interest in obesity and overeating. And so I want to start off by talking a little bit about obesity and the challenges that it poses to us. I then want to spend a few minutes talking about some of the factors that influence food intake. So there's a variety of reasons why people eat. Often we'd like to think it's because people are hungry and need calories, but we know that that's not always the case, that people eat for many different reasons, and sometimes those reasons aren't always because they need calories or because they're even hungry in that traditional sense. I then want to spend a few minutes talking about the brain systems that regulate the rewarding aspects of food. And so although we tend to think about our stomachs and our guts as being the mind behind our food intake, it's actually not the case. Our brain plays a significant role in dictating what types of foods we eat, when we eat, why we eat. And so it's very important that we understand the brain mechanisms that regulate food intake, because they are really the key operators in this process. I then want to spend a little bit of time talking about reward versus addiction. So we talk about food addiction a lot, but we do need to be careful about defining that carefully, because as we know, there are clinical criteria that one needs to meet in order to be diagnosed with having an addiction. And how does that differ from just simply having something be rewarding? So if you find it rewarding to maybe have a cookie once in a while, that's fine, but what about, where do we go into an addiction from there? Where do you draw the line between something just being very pleasurable and enjoyable to something being an addiction that you now no longer can control? I then want to talk a little bit about the construct of food addiction. And so we've amassed a significant amount of data, research studies on this issue, and questions related to food addiction. And so I want to talk a little bit about some of those data and show you some of that. And then finally, I'd like to end with some developmental considerations. And so one of the things that I've been interested in the past couple of years has really been the genesis of food addiction. And so we talk a lot about food addiction and characterizing it, and I spent the better part of my early career discussing, what is food addiction? How can we measure it? Is it a real thing? And now I think the question that I'm most interested in understanding is, well, where does it come from and how can we prevent it? And so I want to talk a little bit about some of our newer studies that are aimed at looking at that aspect. So as I mentioned, I became interested in food addiction pretty early in my career. I was in graduate school at Princeton, and I was trying to think of a topic that I could study for my PhD dissertation. So I needed a project that I could work on. And one thing that had become of interest was this issue of obesity. And I found it really interesting that we were facing this obesity crisis in the US, and it seemed like there was more than enough information out there for people to know what foods they should eat to maintain a healthy body weight. But despite the fact that we had all these diet programs, all this advice, all this information, all these even prepackaged foods available, people still found it really difficult to regulate their food intake and to maintain a normal, healthy body weight. And I kind of thought that was really interesting from a psychological standpoint. And then it became apparent that there had been some research studies that had been looking at the correlation between obesity and the use of sugar in the United States. And a researcher named George Bray in particular had published a study showing that there had been a pretty tight correlation between the obesity rates in the US and the amount of sugar being consumed in the US. And anecdotally, I started looking into this and wondering if, well, maybe people are overeating these foods or can't control their intake of food because sugar could be addictive in some way. And there wasn't any real research studies that I could identify that had been done in the lab on this topic, but there were plenty of anecdotal reports and stories and books that had been written by people who chronicled this journey of, suffering with a food addiction and really characterized the research that we just needed to be able to do. And so that's really where I kind of came into this field and where I became interested in it. So it started off as obesity. I don't think it necessarily only pertains to obesity, because I think there's plenty of people, and we know there's plenty of people who suffer from a food addiction who do not carry the status of being obese. So I think that's an important thing to make, distinction to point out. But just to sort of put this into a framework, I became interested because obesity had become such a crisis in the US. And we know that it is associated with many comorbid health concerns. So individuals with obesity not only are at greater risk for developing heart disease or diabetes or certain types of cancer, but it's also important to note that they also can have severe psychological, economical, and social consequences. And so there's a stigma associated with being overweight or obese. People don't feel as good about themselves often when they're overweight or obese, and they have greater risk for developing anxiety or depression. And then there's also these economic concerns that are related to the costs associated with the medical complications associated with obesity. So I think it's really a problem that affects the whole individual, not just from a medical side, but also from a psychological and emotional side as well. That's why I think it's important that we understand as much as we can about it and help people to maintain a healthy body weight. When we look at the statistics, you can see that the numbers are pretty much there in terms of the fact that we're seeing that the majority of the population is either overweight or obese. And we're also starting to see more and more people developing extreme obesity, which is characterized by a BMI of 40 plus. And if you look at the bottom graph, you'll notice that it's something that we're seeing happening in our children as well. And so even little kids, ages 2 to 5, preschoolers, this is, very young children, are showing increases in the number of percentages of them who are overweight. And also we're seeing some increases in the number who are obese. And this seems to carry on throughout childhood, and presumably, if no changes are made, will affect them into adulthood as well. So the question again is, well, why, despite all these programs, advice, warnings, information that's out there, why do so many people find it difficult to maintain a healthy body weight? Well, I think it's important to point out that obesity is an endpoint with multiple contributing factors. And so we're not going to identify the cause of obesity because there is not just one cause, there's multiple causes. So things such as genetic vulnerability, for instance. Some people are just genetically predisposed to potentially be overweight or obese. There's also changes in the food accessibility that contribute to obesity. We'll talk about those in a minute. There's been lots of changes regarding social norms with respect to food. And so if you think about it, it's pretty much acceptable to eat food anywhere you go these days, right? You can walk into your office and be carrying a sandwich or, a drink that has a lot of calories in it. I mean, it's really socially acceptable to bring food anywhere you go, and that allows people to basically consume calories on a nonstop basis, and that contributes to this obesity crisis that we're facing because of this passive calorie consumption. There's also some stress and endocrine factors, which I don't have time to talk about today, but they certainly contribute to obesity. Increases in portion sizes, which we'll talk a little bit about in a minute. There's genetic disorders such as Prader-Willi syndrome, which have a side effect of obesity. And so that's also something we need to recognize. And the thing we often hear most about is the sedentary lifestyle. And while this is certainly an issue, it's not the only contributing factor. It is something, though, that we need to consider, that we're consuming more calories, but we're not burning them off. And so our lifestyles have changed so that many more people are working in front of computers and sitting for long periods of time as part of their jobs, and they're not getting up and about and moving around as much as traditionally they would have maybe 50 years ago. So the thing that I want to talk mostly about today has to do with this sort of new one on the side, this idea that what about the food that we eat? Could it have something to do with obesity? Maybe there's something about the types of foods that we eat and the way that they make us feel, the rewarding aspects of that food, the hedonic appeal of that food, and perhaps the addiction associated with that food. Could that contribute to obesity in a meaningful way? So I mentioned that the way we acquire food has changed over time. So this is some cartoon that's meant to depict what our ancestors looked like, who were hunter and gatherers. So you could see that you used to have to go out and search for food, maybe walk miles or walk for days to try to find your next meal. And it wasn't always easy, and people, really had to work super hard to get access to food, and were very happy when they did get access to it. But that's changed a bit. This is more like what our food acquisition looks like these days. You can walk into any grocery store or these sort of warehouse stores and buy large quantities of food. We have preservatives, we have refrigerators, so you don't have to worry so much about the food spoiling, as opposed to, historically we had to eat the food as soon as we had it because it would go bad. And so we have a much easier way to acquire food these days than we traditionally did. But again, having this ease of accessibility can contribute to eating perhaps when we're not always hungry. So before we talk about addiction, I want to talk about food. Now, it's interesting because, for many, many years when I first started doing this research, we were so careful to make sure we were defining addiction carefully and being very specific about what we meant by addiction and really giving the definitions. And then a few years ago, I started to think, well, wait a minute, everybody knows what an addiction is. I think that's pretty clear. There's clear medical guidelines for that, but what is a food? We talk about, addiction being a vague concept, but food is an even much vaguer concept, because you can have so many things that fall under this umbrella term of food. And that, I think, can make it difficult to talk about this issue. So let me give you some examples. So this is an example of the nutrition facts label. And here in the US and in other parts of the world, there's similar ways to convey this information. It's basically a label that tells you the percentage daily value of a variety of different nutrients that the USDA has deemed important in a healthy diet. Interestingly, it also tells you the ingredients. And so if you look at the very bottom, you'll see there's a line that says ingredients, and it'll tell you all the things that are in that particular product. And these ingredients have to be listed in order of use, meaning if the majority of the product is whole baby carrots in this case, then that would be the product that's listed first. And each item is listed in order of how much it is used in the particular product. So you can see by looking at this nutrition facts label, it's pretty obvious what this food is, right? It is whole baby carrots, because if you look at the ingredients, you see that that's the only thing that's listed. So this was an easy one. Let me give you another example of a food. So again, here we see a nutrition facts label from a different food. And it's a little bit more difficult to figure out what this food is. If you look at the ingredients list, you can see that there are lots and lots of different things in here. So there is flour, there is some vitamins that have been added, to fortify the product, to make it healthier. There's sugar, there's soybean oil. Then there are all kinds of different colors that are added, and wax, and blue 2-lake, which I assume is some sort of dye. So you could see that it becomes a little bit more difficult to try to figure out what the heck you're eating when you look at this label. But if you were to actually be picking up this product, it would be this. It would be Mini Crisp Pop-Tarts, which are I don't want to say popular, but they're a well-known breakfast item in the United States. They're actually not really a healthy breakfast at all, but they've been marketed that way. And so many people do consume them for breakfast. So the point here is there's a big difference between baby carrots and Mini Crisp Pop-Tarts, but they're both falling under this umbrella term of food. And so they have the same rules and regulations in terms of the way that they're marketed and in terms of the way that they're thought about from the government standpoint. So the big difference, obviously there's many differences between baby carrots and Pop-Tarts, but the biggest difference, or the most relevant difference to this conversation at least, is the fact that the Pop-Tarts are considered a highly processed food. And so they're manufactured in a laboratory somewhere. It's someone's job to sit there and figure out the formula to make the Mini Crisp Pop-Tarts. There's no tree that they pull these things from, or you don't have a bush that you can plant somewhere and then harvest the Pop-Tarts. They're a man-made food. They're something that is a highly processed food. They're put together in the laboratory, and they're designed to taste really good. They're designed to feel good in our mouth. They're designed to be preserved. They're designed not to fall apart when you open up the package, and so they're designed to look pretty. That's very different than other types of foods that are more natural foods like carrots or tomatoes or these other fruits and vegetables. You know, they're in the ground and they're going to grow a certain way and look a certain way. And so the big difference between the two examples I gave is processing. One is a man-made food and the other one is a natural food. So you might say, well, what's the big deal about processing? You process food all the time. If you cook a steak or if you peel a banana, I mean, these are all parts of, you know, what we need to do to eat food. And that is very true. But I think there could be some examples in nature that suggest that processing isn't always something that maybe can be good for the foods that we're eating. So let me give you some other examples. So this is a coca leaf. And in many parts of the world, coca leaves grow. And people who live in those regions where they grow will chew on the leaves, and you know they have no problems at all, not related to the coca leaf at least. Now, I've never met anyone that has had an addiction to coca leaf, but if you take the coca leaves and you process them and you refine them and you extract certain ingredients and you add chemicals to them, very similar to what happens when we're manufacturing many of the foods that we eat, you can very quickly go from something that's natural product, coca leaf, to something that is a highly addictive substance like cocaine or crack cocaine. Another example would be grapes. Grapes are a natural product that can be grown and harvested. However, you can extract the certain components of grapes and do some processing to them and then quickly turn it into something that is highly addictive for many individuals. And so the question becomes, well, could we say the same about some of the foods that we eat? Could you have a natural food, something like corn, and then have a corn-based product that is actually something that's very different because it's highly processed and has lots of other things added to it? And the same can be said about wheat. And then even water and sugar cane. Again, alone in nature, these two things are pretty harmless, and they're actually good for us in some ways. Certainly water is. But if you take these two products and process them and add a bunch of stuff to them, you can very quickly turn them into something that may be difficult for people to regulate their intake of. So again, the point of processing is that it can change the food, and it can change it in a way that might make the natural food something that is no longer something that is the same product. But as I mentioned before, we got interested in this area related to sugar, and in part that was because we had noted that there had been research studies suggesting that there's a very high correlation between the amount of sugar people were consuming and the rates of obesity, especially in the US. And so these are some data that are taken from a few years back, but the numbers are still relatively the same. If you look at the amount of sugar that we eat, it was 22 teaspoons a day. Now, that might not mean much to you if you don't know what's an appropriate amount or an inappropriate amount, but that's actually quite a bit. Now, we know that this is quite a bit because we now in the US have new dietary guidelines that tell us how much added sugar we should be eating. And this is a relatively new development because up until a few years ago, there was no guideline about how much sugar you should eat. And so it was basically suggested that you eat as much as you like. And so now we do actually have guidelines that suggest you should have no more than 10% of your daily calorie intake coming from added sugars. So to translate this, that means if you're on a 2,000 calorie a day diet, that means no more than 200 of those calories should come from added sugar. So that leads to about 12 teaspoons, maybe a little bit less, depending on if you're male or female and if your calorie intake is a little bit less or not. Now, added sugars do not include foods that naturally contain sugar, such as fruit, vegetables, and some milks. And I say some milks because, well, lactose is a sugar that's naturally found in things like cow's milk. Many people are drinking different types of nut milks now, like almond milk, for instance. And the sugar that's found in almond milk is not natural. That is sugar that is added. So it's important that if you're talking about milk or thinking about milk, you understand which milk you're looking at and know that many milks do have added sugars to them now. So you have to be careful in looking at the labels. So let's take a look at some example foods because, to tell people, okay, well, you're not supposed to have any more than, 8 to 10, let's say, teaspoons of added sugar each day. That might not mean much to the average person who doesn't really know how much sugar is in the foods that they typically eat. So this is an example of a popular drink in the United States, a Frappuccino. Many people get these as kind of a treat in the afternoon or, something sometimes, in the morning. And if you look at the sugar intake for this or how much sugar it contains, one Frappuccino has over 100% of the amount of daily value allotment for sugar. So if you have just one of these, you've already had more sugar than you're supposed to have in the entire day, according to the new guidelines. Another example, so a Cinnabon. A Cinnabon is a sweet treat that, again, people will sometimes have these for breakfast or for dessert, and it's something that is pretty popular in the United States. But just one of them has 59 grams of sugar, and so that's over 100% of the daily value. Now you might say, okay, well, everybody knows that Frappuccinos and Cinnabons are kind of on that junk food side of the spectrum, so let's look at something that's considered a little bit more healthy. And so if you take a look at yogurt, many people consume yogurt as part of their daily diet, especially now that we're hearing so much about the importance of probiotics. It's really, manufactured the yogurt industry to develop lots of more products. But if you take a look at how much sugar is in one of these yogurts that have fruit on the bottom, you can see that just one small container of yogurt has 24 grams of sugar. And that's about almost half of the daily amount of sugar you're supposed to have. So you can see that it's very easy to consume way more than the amount of sugar that's recommended, even by breakfast, just by the simple foods that we tend to eat. Now, I mentioned earlier that portion sizes have gone up dramatically over the years, and these are some data taken from the United States CDC, the Centers for Disease Control. And they show that back in 1950s, if you went out to a restaurant with your family, you might go to a restaurant and have like a hamburger, french fries, and a beverage. And the typical sizes of those things were relatively small compared to now. If you go out to a restaurant now, you'll see the size of the french fries has gotten much larger. The size of the hamburger is almost 3 times as much as it's been in the past. And again, the beverages are something that we've seen grow dramatically. And so the typical size of the average beverage is much, much larger than it was going back about 50, a little bit more than 50 years ago. So the sizes of the foods that are presented to us have gotten bigger. And so again, when we're presented, there's a lot of research related to portion size and the visual cues associated with portions that are presented that I don't have time to talk about today, but when you look at something that's put in front of you, that's what you think you're supposed to eat. When you go to a restaurant and they plate you and give you your meal, your mind thinks that's what you're supposed to eat. This is my portion. But that's not the case. A healthy portion is not what we're offered when we go to restaurants these days. It's more like enough for 2 or 3 people in some cases. So I mentioned earlier that in the brain, we have reward-related brain regions that participate in the process of eating. And I have this very simple diagram here that kind of just points out some of these areas, and many of them are deep within the brain. So they're not always cortical regions. These are primitive brain regions that are found in many animals that regulate similar types of behaviors in other animals as well, not just in humans. And one of the things that's really interesting about these regions of the brain that participate in the control of food intake is the fact that drugs of abuse also act on them. And so we know that drugs that are abused act on these brain systems that evolve to reinforce natural behaviors like sexual behavior or feeding behavior. And that is part of the reason why drugs are so addictive, because they basically hijack these primitive brain systems that were put in place to reinforce the things we need to do to survive as a species, right? We need to eat, we need to mate. And so it's important that we find these things pleasurable, otherwise we're not going to want to do them, and then we won't make more people. So drugs act on these same systems that were put in place to reinforce these natural behaviors. And so to me, it seems that many of these designer foods that we have now could potentially be activating these brain reward systems in a way that's not like a food, but more like what happens with a drug. When we're talking about foods that have 60, 70 grams of sugar in one serving, that's a very high amount. That's like what you would see if, you're having nothing in nature. You're not going to find anything in nature that's going to have that amount of sugar in one particular serving. So the question has become, and still is, could some of these designer foods be affecting the brain in ways more like the effect of a drug and not like the effect of a food? So I mentioned earlier that we eat for a variety of different reasons. We like to think that we eat for the reasons of hunger, where hunger is a noun. And if you look at the black and white picture, that's a picture of kids that are meant to be hungry, right? These are kids that have this feeling of discomfort, weakness that's caused due to the lack of food. And that's coupled with a desire to eat. So they want to eat because they need calories. But many kids and adults these days eat for other reasons. They have hedonic hunger. And so this is like what happens after you've had a meal and the dessert cart comes out, or the waitress comes to your table and says, "Oh, would you be interested in dessert?" Even though you may have just had a few hundred calories worth of food and there's no way you're actually hungry, you are hungry for some pleasant sensations that could be associated with a sweet treat or some other type of savory treat. And this is a form of hedonic hunger. And so this has nothing to do with needing calories or energy. It has more to do with the fact that you just are interested in the pleasant sensations associated with the food. And so people eat for both of these reasons. But when we think about the types of foods that people tend to overeat, a lot of it has to do more with the hedonic properties of the food than the hunger-based properties of the food. So we know that people eat because they have to eat, right, when they have a caloric deficit or they need calories, but they also eat because they want to eat. Sometimes people report because they just felt like tasting a certain food that they saw, or they saw an advertisement for a food, or they walked past a place that was selling a certain food and they just said, "Oh, I saw the queue and it led me to go wander into the store and get it." So people don't always eat just because they have a caloric need. They eat because they want to eat. They also eat because they're stressed or bored or lonely. And so food can fill a void for many people that isn't maybe the purpose of it. I tend to try to view food as something that we enjoy because it nourishes us. And I think that many people, because of these different types of foods that are so hyperpalatable, that affect the brain in such significant ways, have come to be able to view food as a way that can make you feel better or reward you. And that's where I think we develop issues. It turns out that the foods that people tend to use when they're in this hedonic way of trying to make themselves feel good are often rich in fats and sugars and often, consequently, because of that, calories. But they often taste really good, and they can activate these brain reward systems in other areas of the brain that can make us want to continue to eat them. It's also the case that palatable food is ubiquitous for most people in our society. So if you go to vending machines or convenience stores, these are the types of foods that are readily available. They don't spoil. There's lots of preservatives in them. So it's something that is easy for people to get their hands on. And again, food has become a big part of our social lives. And so we've always congregated around food as humans, but now the case that, people just put food everywhere they go. And so think about yourself. If you invite people to your home, you're not going to say, "Oh, come over and not give them anything to eat. You're going to offer them something to eat or drink. That's part of being a good host. Same if you meet up with friends or you want to get together, you don't say, oh, let's go meet in the middle of the street and talk. You say, oh, let's go to a coffee shop, or let's go to a cafe, or let's get together for lunch. It's always usually around some sort of meal. So the question that we have been studying for many years is whether or not we could be addicted to the sugar and these highly processed foods that we're seeing happening so often in our society now and becoming so available. So we need to define what we mean by an addiction. And so we have done this by using the DSM criteria for addiction. And so the DSM is the American Psychiatric Association's book that is short for the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. And so this is essentially a book that catalogs all the different mental health issues that are known and provides criteria that one can look at to understand whether or not a person might meet that diagnosis. And it's important because it helps practitioners all stay on the same page and understand the symptoms that one must meet in order to have this particular diagnosis. And so there is no food addiction in this book yet. It had been discussed, but it was determined that there isn't sufficient research on this yet. But I imagine one day we might see food addiction in this book. But there is addiction in general, an addiction to what is meant to be to drugs and alcohol. Also in advance that I think moves us toward finding food addiction potentially in this treatment book one day is the fact that we now have gambling listed as an addiction. And so it used to be the case that it was really like substance addiction where it had to be something you consume, but we're now seeing that process addictions, behavioral addictions are being considered as real addictions too, including gambling. So there are different criteria that one must meet in order to be diagnosed as having an addiction to a substance like drugs or alcohol. And these are all things that are not surprising and that I'm sure you're all familiar with. And so I'm just going to quickly go through them. And so binging, taking more than you want to over a period of time, having a desire or limit to quit but not being able to, spending a lot of time trying to get the substance or recovering from the use of the substance, craving, having an intense desire or urge to use the substance. There's also some social impairment criteria. And so these I think are very much dictated by the laws and social norms of society. And so I often talk about this with respect to smoking. And so, 50 years ago in the United States, everybody smoked. It was like not a big deal. There weren't really any rules or regulations surrounding it. Now it's much more difficult to smoke. And so you can't smoke at work. You can't, smoke on public transportation. You can't smoke in public places. And so that can, I think, dictate whether or not something provides a social impairment. And so social impairment has to do with failure to fulfill major role obligations at work or school at home. So obviously you can't, if you're addicted to drugs or alcohol, you can't, drink alcohol at work, you can't smoke at work. So you could see that could produce a social impairment. With food, it's okay to eat food at work. So it doesn't really apply in this case. So that's where, I think that's an important distinction to make. Also using the substance despite the fact that it can cause social or interpersonal problems. Again, we see this more clearly with drugs and alcohol because of social norms. People don't want to be around you if you're doing cocaine because they don't want to get arrested or get in trouble. It's just sort of something that you don't really want to be involved with. Whereas, the social norms regarding eating food all the time or varieties of different foods isn't something that we have to worry about from a legal standpoint. Having to give up activities due to use, or having to give up, occupational activities or social activities due to use. Again, this is something that we often see happening when it comes to using drugs and alcohol. When we look at the risky use criteria, I do think we now start to see more overlaps with food addiction and with what happens with use of traditional drugs and alcohol. So using the substance despite the fact that it's physically hazardous. So to me, if someone's continuing to use or to eat certain types of foods or overeat foods despite the fact that they've developed, a health condition like diabetes or hypertension or something that's related to their diet, that suggests that they're using it despite the fact that they're harming themselves. Also, there's pharmacological criteria. These are like things such as tolerance, where you need to consume more and more of the substance to feel the same euphoric effect you used to get from just having a little bit of it. and withdrawal. And so withdrawal is something that does not occur with every drug, but it is something that we do hear a lot about in food addiction. And so I'll talk about some of the research in a minute, but withdrawal can be mild in cases with certain drugs like nicotine, for instance. During withdrawal from nicotine, people are very uncomfortable and unhappy, but it's not life-threatening. Whereas withdrawal from opioids, for instance, or opiate drugs, it has a significant impairment, and often people need to be hospitalized to cope with it. So what we've done in our research is to basically take these models or this information related to addiction and understanding the criteria associated with addiction and trying to understand them in a few different models that are related to the brain and behavior. And so we've developed a few different experiments and studies that I'll talk about now, where we look to see whether or not we see these DSM criteria for addiction to food when the substance of abuse is sugar. And so I'm going to walk through some of these data now. So we developed an animal model to study this initially because there weren't really, again, partly because we were neuroscientists and we wanted to study the brain, and partly because we wanted to isolate the variables. And so studying food addiction is really difficult in humans because humans have been exposed to so many different foods and have a history of eating sugar since they were little. And so it's very difficult to find a population that we could use that would be a pure population of individuals that haven't been overexposed to sugars. And so that's going to change them from the outset. And so if we look at our animal models, we can find rats, or we can, cultivate rats that have never tasted sugar, and then compare them to animals that have tasted or have been consuming excessively. So that's part of the reason why we started off with animal models, was to isolate the variables so we could really truly understand, if you take an animal who's never been exposed to sugar and then expose them to sugar in excess, can they develop an addiction? Can they develop these different behaviors and the brain changes? So what we found is that if we give our animals access to a sugar solution and allow them to drink it, over the course of about a month, they show signs of tolerance and binging. So they'll drink more and more of the sugar over the course of a month than animals who have ad libitum access to sugar and chow. And chow is basically the rat food. And so what's interesting is we're giving the animals intermittent access, meaning they get 12 hours a day to drink the sugar solution. And we find that this type of schedule seems to promote binging behavior. And so if you look at the graph on the right, you'll see that the black columns on day one, all the animals are consuming about the same amount of sugar in the first hour of access, the very first day they get it. But if you look out onto day 21 of access, it's the rats that had this binge access, or this limited daily access, that seem to be showing this enhanced intake during that first hour that they get exposed to it. And this is like a binge. Now, interestingly, we ran a control group that was essentially allowed to binge on their rat chow, binge on their food. And you can see that there's really no difference between the first day and the 21st day in terms of how much they ate. So there's something about the palatability of the sugar that causes the animals to overeat it and to binge on it. And that's not something that we see with limited access to a healthy food or something that's really just sort of a bland tasting food. So I mentioned that we wanted to study the brain. And one of the things about addiction in the brain is that it's very well known that dopamine, which is one of the neurochemicals that's involved with the addiction process, it is found to be increased in reward-related brain regions every time a drug of abuse is used. And so this is one of the hallmarks of drug use, is this increase in extracellular dopamine in reward-related brain regions. So this happens with nicotine, cocaine, morphine, you name it, it happens if it's a drug. Now, food also can release dopamine, but the dopamine release that we typically see with food has more to do with the novelty of the food. So it's more about the very first time you have a food or taste a new cuisine, you release dopamine more so to pay attention than anything, right? Because if that food makes you sick, you want to make sure you never go near it again, because it's a survival issue, right? We could die from food poisoning. And that's something that isn't quite so much of an issue nowadays, but back in our primitive brains, which we still often use, food poisoning was a very big issue. You wanted to make sure that you were eating, berries that were healthy and not rotten. Otherwise, it could certainly cause you to become very sick, if not die. And so The dopamine release associated with food is typically seen with a new food and then wanes with repeated access. So the more typically, if you have food regularly or have had it a couple times and it hasn't made you sick, you're not going to release dopamine in response to eating it. Now, what we did in this particular study was we looked at the brains of the animals while they were drinking sugar. And we found that when we give everybody sugar on day 1, all the groups released dopamine, which is what we'd expect because it's the very first time they had sugar. But if you look out on to day 2 and even on to day 21, it's only the rats that have been binging on the sugar that continue to show this rise in dopamine levels. We don't see it happening with animals that have ad libitum access to sugar. These animals are basically attenuating their dopamine release, even though they're still drinking it. And we also don't see this effect in animals that have occasional access to sugar. So we ran a control group that had sugar twice, sucrose twice. And so again, there's something special about binging on the sugar that seems to be producing this effect in the brain. It's more like what you'd expect to see with a drug and less like what you'd expect to see with a food. Now, we also ran a control group. On the bottom panel, you'll see that it was the rats that are binging on chow or have limited daily access to chow. And you can see that on the first day, these animals all released dopamine, presumably because they were hungry and getting used to this new feeding schedule of having been mildly food deprived and then allowed to eat. But by 21 days, we're not seeing a significant increase in dopamine levels. So it's not about the schedule of limited access. It has something to do with this limited access to a highly palatable food that seems to be producing this effect on the brain that suggests that sugar acts more like a drug and less like a food when it's consumed in this manner. We also did some studies to look for withdrawal, and so we can look for withdrawal many different ways. One is to look for signs of anxiety, and this apparatus that I have a picture of here is called the elevated plus maze, and it allows us to measure anxiety in the rat. And what we found is that if you have animals that have been overeating sugar and give them a drug that can precipitate withdrawal, it's called naloxone, it blocks opioid receptors in the brain, or if you simply take their sugar away by fasting them and just do a short fast, that these animals will show signs of anxiety. They're less willing to travel into the open arms of the maze, which is an indication that they're anxious. There's also been many other studies that have looked at depression, changes in blood pressure. We've reported that there's somatic indications of distress, like the animals will show physical signs that they're overtly in a negative state. And so, again, it does seem to be that there is a withdrawal syndrome that emerges by removing the sugar from the animals, and that seems to be mediated in some way by the opioid system. When we look at the brains of these animals during withdrawal, we also see another parallel to drugs of abuse. So what we see is that if we take the sugar away from these animals for 36 hours, that they show a decrease in dopamine coupled with an increase in acetylcholine, which is a neurotransmitter in the brain that's also associated with reward and addiction. And now this decrease in dopamine coupled with an increase in acetylcholine is something that's been reported in the literature quite often for happening during withdrawal from many different drugs of abuse. So we also see this during withdrawal from cocaine, nicotine, morphine. Again, this is another parallel between what we see with drugs of abuse, but in this case, the drug is sugar. When we look at cross-sensitization between a history of using sugar and a known drug, we see some really interesting findings. And so cross-sensitization is a phenomenon in which if you're dependent on one drug, you can have a heightened responsivity to a different drug of a similar class. And so you may have heard about, smoking cigarettes being the gateway to using alcohol, or being the gateway to smoking pot or something like that. And so there is some truth to that in the sense that your brain does become primed to have a heightened response to a different drug if you have a history of using a drug to begin with. And so we wondered if that might happen with sugar. And so we had our rats eating sugar, or binging on sugar, or on these different types of regimens that involve sugar or did not, for about 21 days. And then we took all the animals and instead of sugar, gave them a period where they just had access to their regular food and water. No sugar was available. And then we gave a test day where we gave all the rats amphetamine, and we gave a very low dose of amphetamine, an injection. And this dose wouldn't typically have a physiological effect in the sense where it would manifest as hyperactivity. what we found was the animals that had a history of overeating sugar, who were binging on sugar each day for 21 days, when they were given amphetamine, they were hyperactive in response to it. When other animals were given the same dose of amphetamine, they were not hyperactive in response to it. So again, it seems that having this history of overeating sugar affected their dopamine system in a way that now is making them hypersensitive to the stimulatory effect of amphetamine, which is a dopamine agonist, which affects the dopamine system. We also wondered whether animals who have a history of overeating sugar might be sensitive to other drugs in terms of consumatory behavior, so that would they be more willing or wanting to consume drugs. And so what we did was we had animals that had, in a different study, had a history of overeating sugar, and we gave them alcohol to drink instead of sugar one day. And we found that the animals who had the history of intermittent binging on sugar, overeating sugar each day, were the ones that ended up drinking the most alcohol. So again, we see here some sort of consumatory and locomotor cross-sensitization between sugar and drugs of abuse. Now, craving is something we've also studied. It's a little bit more difficult to study this in our rat models because rats are so, difficult to articulate their words and feelings, whereas humans will tell us, yes, I'm craving this, I want this. But we can do some clever tricks to try to see whether or not rats are willing to engage in risky behaviors in order to get access to a substance. And so the graph on the top is actually from a colleague, Mary Baggiano. She's done work looking at binge eating resistant, or BER rats, and binge eating prone rats, or BEP rats. And she characterizes her rats as binge eating prone or resistant based on their preference for Oreo cookies. So if she gives the rats Oreo cookies, some of them are going to love them and eat a bunch, and those are the binge eating prone ones, and some of them are going to be, yeah, I'll eat them, but they're not the greatest, and those are the binge eating resistant rats. And what she found is that rats who are binge eating prone are more willing to cross an electrified shock grid to get access to an M&M. Now, I'm sure you'll agree that it's not a good idea to cross an electrified shock grid if you're a rat, especially if the reward is just one M&M. But these animals will. These animals who are prone to binge eat will engage in that risky behavior, which suggests that they're craving their sweetness. We've also looked at, in our lab, at operant conditioning, and this is where you lever press. The rats can press a lever and get access to sugar. And we find that if we have rats that are allowed to press a lever each day and get access to sugar for 12 hours a day, and they can develop this binging pattern, that if we put them through a 2-week abstinence period where we basically don't let them have the sugar, that once they are allowed to press again to get access to it, they're working harder than ever before. And so they're more willing to press the lever to get access to sugar if they've had a period of abstinence. And so this again suggests that they're craving it. So we started off looking at sugar, but I think it's important to remember that, humans don't eat just sugar. We eat sugar-rich foods. And so this is part of the reason why it's very easy to get sugar in our diet through a variety of means, because sugar is in so many of the different foods that we tend to eat. And we also tend to eat a variety of foods. And so one of the reasons why variety is good is because it allows us to get access to all the different micronutrients that we might not otherwise get in our diet. If you eat a variety of foods, you're going to presumably have lots of different fruits and vegetables and things that are going to allow us to have all the nutrients that we need to maintain a healthy lifestyle. But that also has a downside to it, because having variety in our diet means we develop something called sensory-specific satiety. And so this is where if you eat the same food over and over again, you kind of get bored with it. You get this satiety to the sensation of, let's say, eating broccoli. But if you were to be offered a different food, then you might say, oh, yeah, I'm sick of eating broccoli, but I could go for, that other food. And so this is why when people go to buffet restaurants, they tend to overeat, because you can pick and choose all these different cuisines. And so if you get satiated of one particular taste, or you're sick of eating soup, let's say, then you can move on to eating chicken. So there's lots of different things to choose from, and this promotes eating. So we were interested in looking at this because there had been some evidence that suggested that this sort of cafeteria style diet, where you can have pick and choose your food items, contributes to overeating. We wanted to look at this within the context of our animal models too, because a lot of the different foods that are in these types of diets are rich in sugars. And so what we did was we did a study where we gave the rats a cafeteria diet. We let them have access to all these different foods that are delicious in addition to their rat food, their healthy rat food, which is a complete diet. So they have bananas, cookies, marshmallows, chocolate, cheddar cheese, salami, peanut butter, Crisco, which is like a fat, basically like pure fat, a sugar solution, and then sweet condensed milk. And they also had their rat food available. And you can see that they really liked the sweet condensed milk. They would eat a majority of their calories coming from that, but they also ate all the different food items as well. They pretty much did not eat any of their healthy rat food. And so what we were interested in looking at is whether or not this variety of food could have an effect on the brain. So obviously when we did this experiment, when we gave the rats all these different foods to eat, they had them for I think about 3 weeks. And of course they became obese. They became what's known as dietary induced obese. So cafeteria dietary induced obese. And we compared these animals to a lab chow group. And so these rats just had plain rat food, no junk food to go along with it. And what we found, if we gave the rats amphetamine, was that the rats that had a history of being on the cafeteria diet released more dopamine in response to that shot of amphetamine. And that makes sense because we know that this history of overeating is affecting their dopamine system, which is now priming them to release more dopamine. What's I think most interesting about this study, if you look at the bottom panel, we then decided to give the rats their food back. And so we gave everyone a lab chow meal. So we gave them the healthy food first. And you could see that the rats who were used to eating the lab chow meal were happy to get that. And they showed an increase in dopamine levels because they were a little bit hungry. But if you look at the bottom line, the cafeteria diet rats, even though they were eating the lab chow meal, they're not showing an increase in dopamine in response to it. It was only when we gave them the junk food that they started to show a rise in dopamine levels. And so what this suggests is that if they have a history of overeating this diet that's rich in variety and sugars, that it changed their brain so that they no longer find healthy food rewarding or reinforcing. They only find the junk food reinforcing. And I think this is important because it speaks to why people who often spend a lifetime or better part of a lifetime eating an unhealthy diet find it so difficult to maintain a healthy eating pattern when they do decide to make the switch. It's because the healthy food just doesn't taste good and doesn't release dopamine. It's not rewarding. The dopamine is being released by the junk food. So I spent a lot of my early career looking at food addiction to try to characterize it in animal models. And lately we've moved on to looking at clinical samples. And so I've been collaborating for many years with Ashley Gerhardt, who is at University of Michigan now. She used to be at Yale. When she was there, she developed something called the Yale Food Addiction Scale. This was basically a scale that allows us to measure whether or not people meet the criteria for food addiction. So much like we were doing in our animal models, looking for DSM criteria for addiction, a scale was developed to see whether or not people might meet those criteria for addiction when it has to do more with eating behaviors than substance abuse. It's a Likert style scale, and it asks people questions like, I have to rate whether or not I find myself continuing to eat something even though I'm no longer hungry, or eating to the point where I feel physically ill. This is in the public domain, and it's relatively easy to score. There's a long version and a 10-item version. The 10-item version is actually a fair amount easier to score, and people are using this in research throughout the world. And so when this study was, or the scale was first developed, it was back in 2009. It was tested in a group of undergraduates, and it was found that 11% met the criteria for having a food addiction. And now you might think, oh, wow, that doesn't sound very high, but if you look at the percentage of the general population that has a drug addiction, it's about 11%. So to me, I think that that's on par with what we would expect. Now, if you focus in on individuals who are more at risk based on what we understand about eating behavior, if we look at obese participants, studies show that 25% meet the criteria for having a food addiction. If we look at individuals who are even more at risk, so individuals who have obesity and also comorbid binge eating disorder, then we see the numbers going up to over 50% meeting the criteria for food addiction. So again, this is just a few of the many studies that have been done looking at, different populations with this scale. A study that I particularly like that really nicely replicates our studies done in rats is this study looking at MRI, brain MRI, and its relation to food addiction. So what they found in this particular study was that individuals had a correlation between their their score on the food addiction scale and their activation of reward-related brain regions that they were put in an fMRI scanner. And the activation was associated with the cue of a highly palatable food. I believe it was a milkshake. So again, the higher your score on the food addiction scale, the more powerful the brain activity is going to be in these reward-related brain regions in response to a highly palatable food. So one thing that has been a question lately is which foods are addictive. So clearly, sugar is an ingredient. I don't like to consider it a food because it's in so many different things. And people don't eat just sugar. And it's difficult to tell people, you know, what they can and can't eat or shouldn't eat or should think about eating, because we have such variety in ingredients and such a variety of foods out there. But I think the thing that's going to help people is to try to understand, well, which foods might be criteria for having addiction. Is it all the foods that have sugar in it? How much sugar? Because there's certainly foods that have sugar in them that I don't think would be considered addictive. Like, for instance, apples. People can eat apples and they have a fair amount of sugar in them, but it's also balanced with fiber and other nutrients that doesn't cause it to have the same effect on our body and brains that a candy bar would, for instance. So we've become interested in understanding which foods are addictive, and this would, I think, help people to better understand their food choices. So we did a study a few years back in collaboration with some colleagues at University of Michigan, where we wanted to understand which were the most problematic foods. So we asked people to identify which foods they found to be most addictive. And the most addictive foods were found to be pizza, chocolate, chips, cookies, and ice cream. Probably is of no surprise to anyone on the call. And the least addictive foods were found to be cucumber, carrots, beans, apples, and brown rice. And so this was important because it was the first measure that allowed us to understand which foods are associated with addictive overeating. And when we looked at the analysis that we did on the different properties associated with these foods, it turns out that the positive predictors of whether or not a food was going to be identified as addictive was how heavily it was processed. So the more heavily processed the food, the more likely it was to be identified as addictive. And I think that makes sense going back to the beginning part of the lecture where we talked about processing and how that can change a food and make it into something that it perhaps did not start off as. And so if you look at things like pizza, for instance, pizza is so highly processed because every single ingredient in the pizza is also highly processed. And so the cheese, the pepperoni, the pasta sauce, and even the dough itself is a highly processed product. So one thing that we are now looking at is how we can mitigate food addiction. And I think, you know, I don't want to say I'm done characterizing food addiction, but I think that there is such sufficient evidence that supports the concept that food addiction can exist, that it's now time to start to think about how can we fix it? How can we help people who are suffering from it? And how can we prevent it from happening to begin with? One of the things that we've been interested in my lab is looking at early life exposure. We know that diet in utero can have long-term effects on the outcome of the offspring. And so we know from studies that have been done over the years that if babies are exposed to drugs in the womb, that can promote addiction later on. They can be born addicted to drugs and have a heightened chance of becoming addicts later on. And we also know that maternal obesity is a very significant problem, especially in the United States. More than half of women who are of childbearing age, the average childbearing age woman is overweight or obese. And so most people who are entering a pregnancy already overweight or obese. And we know that this can also increase the risk of obesity for the offspring in addition to causing other problems with the pregnancy and complications. We know that diet in utero can have long-lasting effects on food intake and preference. And so we know that what a woman eats during pregnancy or doesn't eat during pregnancy can have an effect on the offspring. And there's been some historical studies, such as the Dutch winter famine, which documented during World War II about how, women who were exposed to the famine in parts of Europe who were pregnant ended up giving birth to babies that grew up to become overweight. And you might think, oh, well, that doesn't make sense. If they were starved during pregnancy, you would think the baby wouldn't have developed properly. But it turns out that the baby's brain developed thinking that it was in a starved environment, and so it was always seeking out food. And so that's why when we look back at the historical research and studies that have been done to sort of replicate what happened during the famine, that not eating appropriately during pregnancy can have a long-term outcome on the food preferences and body weight of the baby as well. So we've done some research in this space, looking again in our rat models. And what we've found is that if we have rats that are exposed to a high-fat diet or a control diet, and that's just basically a healthy diet. And I should note the high-fat diet also has a significant amount of sugar in it. I label it a high-fat diet because that's what the manufacturer of the diet calls it, but it's a high-fat, high-sugar diet. If we look at mother rats who are exposed to a high-fat diet or a control diet during pregnancy, we can see that if we look at the offspring, that the rats who were exposed to the high-fat diet in utero weigh more than rats exposed to the control diet. They also eat more of a high-fat diet if we give them a little test meal of exposure to it. Interestingly, these rats also show increased circulating triglyceride levels. So this is interesting because, again, they're not eating the high-fat diet. They were just exposed to it in utero. So they grow up eating a healthy diet, but yet they still tend to weigh more than rats that were exposed to a controlled diet in utero. And they still have a preference for a high-fat diet, and they still have higher triglyceride levels. We were also interested in looking at the behaviors in these animals. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm going wrong way. I don't have that slide in here, but when we did look in a subsequent study to this, we found that these animals who had been exposed to the high-fat diet, or in another study, a high-sugar diet, that the offspring who were exposed to these things in utero were more likely to drink alcohol and were more hyperactive in response to amphetamine. So they had a heightened sensitivity to drugs of abuse later in life. And I think this is interesting because, again, this harkens back to the fact that all we did was expose these animals to the diet in utero while they were developing. They had a regular, healthy diet through the rest of their life, yet they have these behavioral and brain changes that are associated with propensity toward addiction. So I'm going to end here because I want to leave time for questions. But the thing that, I think most people will come to me who are not too keen on this research or don't believe in it quite yet will say is it really like a drug addiction? What about the loss of control we see with addiction? Well, what I will say in response to that is the loss of control that has to be associated with addiction, it doesn't have to be as extreme as we tend to think about it. And it's often dictated by social norms. And so we tend to think about the person in the top picture as our typical addict, right? Someone who maybe has trouble with the law, can't have a job, really has a lot of personal problems, and is really having a very hard time maintaining a normal life. That's actually not the most common addict in our society. The most common addict in our society is a smoker who is like a fully functioning individual, probably has very little noticeable intoxication. The withdrawal syndrome is not physically life-threatening, although uncomfortable. But because of smoking's health-related complications, it is the #1 preventable cause of death in the United States. So I think we're going to talk about addiction to sugars and highly processed foods. We need to talk about it within the context of nicotine addiction because it resembles it in so many different ways, not only from a biological standpoint, but also from the way we're looking at it socially. Okay, and to summarize, this is taken from a review paper that a colleague wrote a few years back where the review was focused on food addiction and which criteria for the DSM criteria for addiction had been met. And you can see that pretty much everything had been met for both human models and with animal models when it comes to each of these different criteria that are associated with addiction. So I want to thank you for your attention and for listening. I also want to thank the people who've sponsored the research over the years. I also want to mention that I have a wonderful TED Ed lesson. I've partnered with TED to produce this lesson. We did this a few years ago. And it's fabulous. It's about 5 minutes long, and it's animated, and it takes everything I just took an hour to say and condenses it into a 5-minute video that's very user-friendly. It's something that's shown in middle schools and high schools children, and it's also something that adults, find to be very well done. So please check that out. And I will take any questions that anyone has at this point.
Hi, Nicole. It's Bitten over here.
Hi.
I've shared that TED talk with my students for some years. It's excellent, I would say that. And
Thank you.
they read your books and all that. And to me, I worked with this for years, so it's like any drug addiction to me. And what I was thinking, and I thought about the loss of control. I've seen people eat themselves to death, although they know. I mean, they have such horrible consequences. So, I mean, yes. But what about insulin? I'm thinking about, eating all that processed food will increase insulin. Is there anyone looking at, hyperinsulinemia and those consequences in relation to craving, the volatile blood sugar? Is there any research done on those two together?
Yeah, that's a great question. We haven't been looking at insulin. There are people who are more on the endocrinology side of this that I know are interested in the effects that, highly palatable foods can have on blood sugar and insulin response. I don't really know of anyone who's looking at it within the context of addiction. And I think that that's a missing component, because I think, when people are eating foods in this binge-like manner, they're basically getting boluses of sugar from the food, and that is going to have a significant impact on insulin levels and how the way insulin is going to function, not only in the periphery but also in the brain. So I don't have a good answer for you, other than I don't really think that it's been well studied, and I do think it's an important point that we should look into a bit more.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Nicole. This was as incredible as I thought it would be, for sure, and a lot of information. I would want to open the floor up for people to ask questions. Pick Nicole's brain. Go ahead, everybody.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
Sure, go ahead.
Okay, so I know that you're doing a lot of work on like babies and toddlers and what to eat. So I found, well, specifically with my sister, she has children who are 4 and 6 and have been exposed to processed food for so long. So now it's kind of, do you have resources or like techniques that you've used to get them off the sugar and that you could provide? Because I also have clients with children that are trying to make meals for everyone, and it's a challenge for them too.
Yeah, no, it's a challenge for a lot of people, and I can speak to this as a parent too, because I have a 3-year-old and a 10-year-old, so I know that it's a challenge to get kids to eat healthy, especially because they spend a significant amount of time outside of the home where they're exposed to foods at school, and there's birthday parties and there's events, and so it can be a real challenge. I would say one resource would be the book that you see pictured here, What to Feed Your Baby and Toddler. This is a book that actually just came out a few months ago that was a follow-up to my book, What to Eat When You're Pregnant. And the What to Feed Your Baby and Toddler, a lot of it is about, introducing foods to a baby so that they don't get addicted to sugar, essentially. So what are the ways in which you can introduce, healthy foods to your baby and have that be basically something that they carry throughout their life? Because there's so much research now that suggests that what we are exposed to in the first 1,000 days of life basically is the imprint for the rest of our life. And so I'm really interested in trying to educate people about the importance of eating healthy during pregnancy, but also in those first couple of years of life up to age 2, because what babies are exposed to at that point can really have a long-term impact on their health, food choices, and preferences, which can be difficult to break. But in the book, I do talk about, what do you do if you have a toddler that you maybe started off eating, some of the more processed types of baby foods that are out there, and now that you find that they're resistant to eating the healthy foods. There are ways in which you can change it. It just takes a lot of persistence and coaching and a lot of psychological tactics that I talk about in the book. So that's one resource. I also do a fair amount of work with schools and school programming to try to educate parents and also people in the schools, including the children, about healthy eating and about recognizing, you know, how much is too much, and policing yourself about, you know, if it's, you know, Joey's birthday today and you have a cupcake, maybe when you get home from school, that doesn't mean you should have another sweet snack. And so really kind of talking about, you know, recognizing sugar in the diet and trying to get them on board with understanding, you know, why you need to eat healthy. It's not about body weight. It's not about the way you look. It's about being healthy on the inside so you can have energy to play with your friends and do all that. So yeah, those are a couple of ideas, but it is certainly a challenge, and it's something that I think about and write about a lot. So yeah, stay tuned, because I think I'll be doing more in that space.
Thanks so much.
Can you talk a little bit about health policies, government level or private industry level health policies that would help?
Yeah, I mean, health policy, well, you know, things have not really changed much, at least in the US. I mean, we now have, it's been required that the food companies disclose the amount of added sugar on the nutrition facts label. Many companies have abided by that, but there's been many companies that have lobbied to, you know, get it so that there's more time before that becomes a law or a requirement. And so I think that, you know, that's really been the one big change that's happened lately that has, I think, opened people's eyes about sugar in particular. Because if you look at a food product that has, you know, 200% of your daily value of sugar, you might think twice about eating it or feeding it to your kids, especially. And so I think that that's been the one move politically that has really helped to bring awareness to this issue. Again, I think there's so much more to be done. I mean, especially when it comes to, you know, school lunches and, you know, just sort of information that's out there about healthy eating. We have the My Plate in the United States, which, you know, again, it doesn't really address the core fundamental issues associated with how you can eat a healthy diet. It tells you an example of what they deem to be healthy, but again, it has a lot of grains in it. I think there should be more vegetables. And I think there could be changes that are associated with the ways in which we can help people to better adhere to a healthy eating than just showing them a plate and saying, oh yeah, this is what your plate should look like.
Thank you.
Yep.
Anybody else? I just wanted to say, Nicole, you know, how interesting it was for me to hear, you know, the effect of the feeding while the child is in the uterus and how that affects. I would think that kind of science would be very interesting in the world at large, to get this information out, you know. And it's been my experience when it comes to your child, you want to do the best you can for your child, and people just don't know this information. So
yeah, I agree. I think that's part of the reason that inspired me to write these trade books, was to help people who are consumers to understand the research and to know about it. Because I think you're correct that, you know, people just aren't aware of these studies that have been done. And I think that by learning about them, it really can make people think twice and maybe make some changes in their diet if they know that it has a long-term effect, not only on their health, but also on the health of their baby and their little one.
yeah.
Nicole, I have a question.
Yeah.
Thank you, first of all, for being here today. There seem to be two different schools of thought in terms of grains. And can you speak, you know, whether grains are, I don't know, should be eaten or shouldn't be eaten, particularly for recovering addicts? Is there, could you speak to something about how whatever the content of, like brown rice, you know, whole grains, has, what effect that has on the brain or on the body?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's sort of difficult to answer. So I think that addiction is such a specific, individualized issue that it's hard to sort of give advice about which particular foods some people should eat and shouldn't eat. And I think grains is one of the foods that, I've met people over the years who have identified as having a food addiction, but can eat grains because they don't find that they overeat grains, that they can eat them as a part of their diet, and they're able to regulate how much they eat. It doesn't seem to have an effect on their blood sugar or on their physiology in a way that causes them to want to go overeat something else. However, I've met other people who, just because of their physiology, are very sensitive to anything that's going to stimulate the release of blood glucose in that way. So even people who find that they can't even eat brown rice or flours or things like that because it just does something to them that then causes them to crave and not be able to regulate their intake. So I don't want to say that it's okay or not okay to eat grains. I think that it depends on the individual, depends on their history. I think, when I talk about food addiction, I talk about it kind of more globally in the sense that, I think that many people are addicted to food and don't even realize it. And I think that, it's not so much because they need to cut out grains, but they need to start off by cutting out all the processed foods and the junk foods and all these foods with all this added sugar. And I think once someone does that, if they find that they're still not able to control their intake or they're still not feeling right, that it might be a good idea to then think about cutting out some of these other carbohydrates like grains, for instance, to see if that could be the trigger that's maybe causing you to, not be able to control your intake. So hopefully that answers your question. I know it's sort of like a non-answer, but that's kind of the best I can do. That's sort of how I view it.
Hi, Ernesto Bergman here. Hi, thank you so much. Can you hear me? Hi.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm very interested in in everything you've talked about, but my question would be about the reward system and the dopamine. What since sugar is addictive, and the idea of the reward system, that the normal food becomes, you don't have the dopamine, I'm not a scientist, the dopamine level is reduced. What happens, one thing is, what happens if there is complete abstinence? Do your dopamine levels return to a kind of normal equation, like eating good, healthy food? And is it really possible to contain and maintain like a 6 teaspoon or 8 teaspoon a day sugar quota and still maintain this kind of dopamine? To have one cupcake for your son's birthday party and then not eat another chocolate chip cookie when you get home. Is that possible? I mean, sounds great, but.
Yeah, no, I think that you raised some really good points. And so, the recommendations that have been put forward to have like between 6 to 8 teaspoons or whatever it is, again, I don't know how they're based on, guidelines that were developed that would suggest what a healthy proportion of sugar would be. But I don't think they were designed on what a realistic proportion would be, right? And so we see that just from the images of the foods that I'd showed that had significantly more sugar in them just in one serving. And you raised a good point of talking about the fact that how realistic is that? Like, if you have a cupcake, could that set somebody up to then not be able to control themselves and then have another cupcake and another cupcake? So it doesn't really address the craving component of it. And, can some people just stop at 6 to 8 teaspoons? And again, that's where I think it comes down to really individual differences. I do think that there are people out there who don't have addictions to the extent that, others do, to the point where they can have a moderate amount of sugar and not lose control and be able to have that 6 to 8 teaspoons. But I think that there's a significant number of more people who maybe that even might be too much. And it's going to be very difficult for them to stay within those guidelines. And so to kind of go back to the beginning part of your question about, if you eat a healthy diet, does that like reset the dopamine to be normal again? The answer to that is we really don't know. There's been some studies that were done in rats that look a month out. And I think there was a study that did 3 months out of, 3 months into eating healthy, and then saw what the dopamine levels look like. And there were still changes that were different than control animals. And so what I like to tell people is, I think it's just like with smoking cigarettes. Like people who are addicted to sugar are like people who are addicted to smoking or addicted to nicotine, in that, you know, you can go 30 years without ever wanting sugar or, you know, ever giving into a craving, but there's going to be one day where you might smell it or see something that could potentially trigger you. And so you're going to be different than a person who doesn't have an addiction. It's something that you have for the rest of your life, even though you're coping with it and it's not consuming you. It's something that I think you always need to be aware of, because I don't think that our brain is ever going to go back to the way it was before we were ever exposed to sugar. I think we're always going to be primed to have that relapse, and our dopamine system is always going to be, I think, susceptible to these environmental things that could cause us to overeat.
Thank you very much. One more question. Is that related to the memory section of the brain? It's as if, what is that called again?
Yeah, so the hippocampus. So the picture of the brain I showed earlier, it had a picture of the hippocampus in there. All the primitive brain areas are connected. So our limbic system is really what is driving all these sort of behaviors. And the memory does have a lot to do with it, because, you know, you have these positive associations that you might form between sugary foods and experiences. And so some of it might be, you know, I've heard people talk about how, you know, a lot of their addiction to maybe sweets started when they were children, and, you know, it was kind of like a family thing where they would bake cookies with grandma, or, you know, their mother would give them sweet treats, or, you know, they had these sort of emotional attachments to the food and the people that they were eating with. And then there's also just the physiological relationship, right? So you have a memory of feeling good after you eat cookies because you did feel good after you eat cookies because it was releasing dopamine. And so we carry these emotional laden memories, but we also have these physiological memories that, you know, don't go away. And so that's something that we have to constantly cope with, because even though you're actively not eating sugar, when you are offered it, or if you see it, or it's, you know, an advertisement for it, or you're somehow reminded of it, you have to, you know, maybe not consciously, but subconsciously combat those memories that are going to be there about it.
Okay. Wonderful questions and wonderful answers. We have room for one more question if somebody's burning here.
I thought this might be a question you would like to answer.
I would also like to ask a question. This is Anna.
Why don't you go ahead?
Okay, so I'm working with a client. He's obese, but he's on a meal plan. He's working a program, no sugar, flour. And then he has this cheat day every 2 weeks where he eats whatever, whenever. And the next day he's back on the meal plan, 2 weeks, great. And then he does this. So what are the consequences, or what do I tell someone like this? Please help.
Right. Well, I think that one thing that might be helpful to them would be to show them my TED Ed video, because it talks and it visually shows what happens in your brain when you eat sugar. And I think what happens when people incorporate these cheat days in, it really does cause them to set themselves back, because they're not able to really start the process of healing their brain system. My dog just walked in, by the way. They're not able to start the process of healing the dopamine system. They're constantly, they're going 2 weeks of depriving, you know, the dopamine system of the reward, and then what happens? They're, you know, having this cheat day where they, you know, flood the system with dopamine and sugars and things like that that are going to release dopamine. And so I think it just makes it more difficult to ever really be able to cope with the cravings and to ever really get off of sugars and flours or whatever it is they're trying to get off of, because they're constantly just giving into that addiction. Even if it's just once every 2 weeks, they're still giving into it.
Yeah.
So I think that, you know, psychologically, I think the cheat day, and there's many diet programs that incorporate this model, you know, the cheat day is meant to be like so that people will have something to look forward to, that so they don't feel like it's too arduous. It's like they're never going to be able to do it, right? They could just all I got to do is get to that cheat day, and then I'll be able to get what I want. But I think the bigger question has to be, well, what do you really want long term? Do you want to just get to your cheat day, or do you want to be free from food and be able to eat healthy and be happy and not be, you know, focused on a certain day of the week that you're going to get to binge? So I tend to view the cheat days as not very helpful. And I think that, it goes back to basically you're just starting over again every day after that cheat day.
So what happens, like, if you're saying that basically the dopamine levels in the brain normalize if they don't have the cheat day, or other
They're
brain
beginning, right. So they begin, you know, eventually, like I said, they're never going to go back to completely normal, but they're beginning to adapt to the process of not having this constant stimulation of sugar. So the receptors are going to be changing. The gene expression is going to be changing. And all these processes are going to start to change to adapt to the fact that, okay, we're not going to be constantly stimulated by sugar. The withdrawal process is going to be easier to cope with because, you know, they're going to have certain numbers of days that have gone by where they haven't had this sugar. And so, again, when you reintroduce the sugar and have that cheat day, you're essentially negating all of that. And so the receptors go back to where they were. You know, it's really just kind of erasing the work that you've done for the 2 weeks up to that point. And so I think that, if anything, if your client was hell-bent on having a cheat day, you might want to think about extending it so that, okay, instead of having the cheat day every 2 weeks, maybe next week you're going to have it every 3 weeks, and then every 4 weeks, and basically trying to wean them off of that cheat day, because I think that if they were to go longer, they might realize how much better they're going to feel, and they're going to see more progress. And they might not want the cheat day because they're going to realize, well, the cheat day is kind of setting me back. That's an idea that, you know, I think could help. Really just trying to get away from the cheat day and focus more on like the long-term positive goals.
It's helping him right now to stick to this thing, and I'm not sure, it's a very difficult, complex person, you know, and he's eating different than how other people would eat too. So right for now it's working, but I could maybe extend it to 3, but I think he's gonna get like, oh, how can I hold it together for 3 weeks, you know, hold it together.
Yeah. Right. I think that's the challenge and that's, you know, he's got to eventually got to hold it together for the rest of your life. Right. So I think that, you know, I think people often become dependent on those cheat days. And I think it makes it more difficult to get through this than it would be without them.
So what is then?
So Anna, I would like to get
sure. Okay, thank you so much for your expertise. It's been very amazing. Thank you for your expertise.
Thank you Anna, for your questions. And if we would have Phil for our last question for the day.
Well, this is a question that you might want to have us know about. What do professionals and the general public need to know about the funding and support for research on food addiction? Where does it need to go? Where are the problems?
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. It's a huge problem. And so it's been very difficult to get government funding to support the research on food addiction. I know myself and a couple other researchers whose labs are heavily focused on this have really become reliant on private donations to fund a lot of the studies because the government just doesn't fund this type of work. And so I think that, you know, if you could help get the word out to people who, you know, might have resources where they could help to donate money or might, you know, be aware of organizations who would be interested in supporting this type of research, there's really a need for it. And I've set up a GoFundMe page for people who are interested in donating to research in our lab. And we also take donations directly through the university. But it's terrible that it's become the case that that's really the way we've had to rely on ways to fund this. It's really just people out there who understand and believe in it and say, yeah, we need to keep this research going because, you know, obviously the food companies aren't going to support it. And, you know, the government has just not gotten behind this. If anything, they've, you know, kind of sided with the food industry in many ways when it comes to the research. So we really just need to get help from donors.
What's your GoFundMe page?
It's just, I believe it's, I can send Esther the link if she'd like to circulate it, but it's Dr. Nicole Avena. If you put that in, that it should pop up. Yeah.
Good. Thank you.
Thank you.
You're getting better and better.
Thank you. And if anyone has any follow-up questions, I gave my emails, and please feel free to reach out if I could be a resource in any way. I'm happy to help.
I need to go. Nicole, I just want to say it's an excellent lecture. You need to be out there much bigger. I'm going to spread the word. And I love the speed and the tempo and how you talk. Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you very much.
This particular lecture would be one we would like to have available for our treatment settings.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm hoping to get to that with you, Nicole. Put you into our textbook.
Yes.
For the counselors and counseling, and because of that, of course, is we have a big chapter on alcohol and drugs, but we do need more of the science of food addiction for sure, and you really plugged that in for us. So hope to put that in there more. And I also actually was thinking while you were talking, and Bitten actually put that in too, is that for you researchers and scientists, to get acquainted with what treatment for food addiction is all about. I'm not sure, how and what you are familiar with in that area, and there is actually a lot of resource in the Impact School to get that understanding, and we're putting that material more and more together so that can be readable for you if you'd be interested. So
yeah, that'd be great. That'd be great.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I have to sign off, but I really appreciate you having me here, and I hope to hear from many of you soon.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Okay, take care.
Bye. Bye.
Bye-bye. Okay, so you just end, yes. Okay, everybody else, I'm gonna just turn off the recording at this time.